My sister betrayed me and married my millionaire fiance. Years later, I struck back. The moment my sister walked into my mother's funeral holding the arm of the man who was once supposed to be my husband, I knew the universe was about to settle a debt that had been collecting interest for 7 long years. I didn't cry or freeze or look away. Instead, I felt calm, the kind of calm that only comes right before a truth explodes. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the Memorial Hall in Charleston, South Carolina, slow, confident, intentional. Every head turned, not because she was grieving, but because she looked victorious. Perfect black dress, diamond earrings, that smug posture she always wore when she thought she had beaten me at something. And beside her was Julian Cross, my former fiancé, my betrayal, my past mistake, dressed in an expensive suit. 7 years ago, he was the man I thought I would grow old with. 7 years ago, my sister Liana stole him and married him. 7 years ago, she took everything she thought mattered, and now she was here to remind me. I stood near the front with my husband while my father sat beside us, hollowed out by grief. The room smelled like lilies and polished wood, soft music played and condolences floated around me like background noise, but none of it mattered, only her did. Liana's eyes locked onto mine as she entered, and her lips curved into that familiar smile that said, "I won." She leaned toward Julian and whispered something that made him tense, and that alone told me more than she ever could. They approached slowly because appearances always mattered to her. Julian spoke first, saying he was sorry for my loss in that polite, rehearsed voice he used for people he didn't care about. I nodded once and said nothing. Liana hugged my father, then turned to me. Her perfume was expensive, sweet, heavy. It had always made me feel like I was choking. "It's been a long time," she said. "Yes," I replied, "it has." Her eyes flicked down to my hand, and I saw satisfaction flash across her face when she didn't see anything extravagant there. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, and whispered, "Life turned out pretty well for me. I got everything." And that was when I smiled. Not bitter, not forced, but real. "Have you met my husband yet?" I asked. Her expression faltered just for half a second, but it was enough. Before she could answer, he stepped forward, calm, composed, unimpressed, and Julian went pale. But 7 years earlier, I never would have believed this moment was coming. Back then, my life looked perfect on paper. I was 31, living in Raleigh, North Carolina, working as a commercial real estate analyst for a national development firm. Long hours, sharp suits, a rising career that finally made my parents proud. Julian Cross entered my life at a charity auction hosted by one of our firm's investors. He was 38, a tech investor, self-made, charismatic in the way that makes people feel chosen when he looks at them. He didn't just talk to me, he focused on me. We talked about urban growth, travel, books. He laughed easily, listened attentively, and by the end of the night, he had my number. By the end of the month, he had my heart. Our relationship moved fast. Helicopter rides, weekend trips to Napa, exclusive restaurants with menus that didn't list prices. My mother adored him instantly, saying he was ambitious but grounded. My father respected him, saying he looked you in the eye, and that mattered. And then there was my sister. Liana was 2 years younger, beautiful, magnetic, chronically unsatisfied. Growing up, she wanted whatever I had: toys, friends, attention, approval. If I succeeded, she competed, and if I struggled, she smiled. Still, I chose her as my maid of honor because I believed adulthood had changed us, and because my mother believed family came first. Julian proposed after 18 months on a private terrace with city lights and a ring that could have funded a small business, and I said yes. That was when everything began to rot. Julian became distant, critical, cold in subtle ways. Liana became involved, too involved. She volunteered to help with vendors, dress fittings, cake tastings. She texted Julian directly, saying it was easier. I ignored the warning signs until I found her necklace in his car, until I heard his voice whispering on the phone at 3 in the morning, until I walked into a short-term rental he claimed was for meetings and found my sister sitting on his lap. She didn't cry or apologize. She looked at me and said he chose me. The wedding was canceled quietly, efficiently, brutally. 6 months later, they were married, and I left. I moved across the country to Seattle with nothing but a job offer and a broken sense of self-worth. I rebuilt myself slowly, painfully, honestly. I met my husband 3 years later, but Liana never stopped believing she had won, until my mother died and fate finally put us in the same room again, and this time I wasn't the one about to lose everything. I didn't acknowledge the tension in the room as Liana stared at my husband, trying to place him within her world of status and influence. My father shifted beside me, still weak from grief, and I gently squeezed his hand to steady him. Julian avoided looking directly at my husband, and that told me everything. But the story of how I arrived here didn't begin with revenge or triumph, it began with survival. When I left Raleigh, I didn't tell anyone I was running. I told them I was chasing an opportunity. Seattle was cold, unfamiliar, and lonely. I rented a small apartment overlooking an alley, not a skyline, and threw myself into work because it was easier than feeling. I took every project no one wanted: redevelopment plans, distressed assets, failing neighborhoods. I stayed late, learned more, earned less, and rebuilt my confidence piece by piece. Therapy helped, but progress was slow. Trust felt like a language I no longer spoke. 3 years later, at a municipal infrastructure conference, I met Daniel Hawthorne. He wasn't flashy or charming in a way that demanded attention. He was quiet, analytical, a civil engineer who specialized in structural failure investigations. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did, there was purpose behind his words. We talked about cities, resilience, and how cracks always form long before buildings collapse. Something about that stayed with me. We exchanged cards with no expectations. Months passed before we spoke again, when he emailed asking for my insight on a redevelopment project. Our connection grew professionally first. Lunches about zoning turned into conversations about life. He never rushed me, never pressed, never asked me to be anything other than honest. The first time I told him about Julian and Liana, I waited for judgment or pity, but he simply nodded and said, "Betrayal rewires you. It doesn't define you." I learned later that Daniel had his own scars. He had testified against a powerful investment group after uncovering safety violations tied to offshore funding. It cost him friends, contracts, and years of advancement, but he never regretted it. Integrity, he told me, was the only thing that lets you sleep at night. Loving him was not a dramatic fall. It was a steady landing. We married quietly 2 years later, no spectacle, no audience, just a promise to choose honesty every day. My relationship with my parents remained close, though strained by distance. My mother tried to bridge the gap between Liana and me, but I wasn't ready. She sent updates I didn't ask for about Liana's life. The mansion, the trips, the appearances. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Then the call came late one night, my mother's voice unsteady, telling me she was sick, very sick. I flew back as often as I could while juggling work and a marriage built on patience. Daniel came whenever he could, standing quietly in hospital rooms, never making it about himself. When my mother passed, the world seemed to pause just long enough for unresolved pain to surface. And now, standing at her funeral, watching Liana cling to Julian like a trophy, I finally understood that grief strips people bare. Some reveal strength and others reveal desperation. Liana broke the silence later, pulling me aside, her voice sharp with false confidence as she listed acquisitions, estates, and future plans. She needed me to see her success, to validate her choices. I let her talk until she finished, then calmly introduced Daniel. The shift was immediate. Julian recognized him instantly and fear crossed his face. Daniel Hawthorne was the man whose investigation years earlier had triggered regulatory scrutiny that dismantled Julian's largest venture fund. Liana didn't know that part of the story yet. Julian did. And in that moment, I realized the twist I never planned, but fate had written anyway. The man my sister left me for had lost everything that mattered, while the man I rebuilt my life with had quietly risen by doing the right thing. And for the first time in 7 years, I felt free. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to win. The tension that followed us back into the memorial hall felt heavier than the rain outside, as people whispered and glanced between Julian, Daniel, and Liana, sensing something unspoken had shifted. My father lowered himself into the front row, breathing shallow and uneven, and I stayed close to him, afraid grief had finally pushed his heart too far. The service began with soft music and shared memories, but I barely heard the words because my awareness kept drifting to my sister, whose posture had lost its sharp confidence. Julian kept checking his phone, his jaw tight, as if bracing for bad news he could no longer control. When the officiant invited family members to speak, I stood first, my legs unsteady but my voice clear, as I talked about my mother's quiet strength, her belief that truth always surfaced eventually, and her hope that her daughters would one day stand on the same side again. I felt Liana watching me, and when I stepped down, she rose next. Her voice cracked after only a few sentences, and for the first time in years, she looked human instead of victorious. Halfway through her speech, my father's hand tightened around mine, then slipped as his breathing grew labored and his face drained of color. I called for help, and chaos rippled through the room as mourners rushed aside and a retired physician stepped forward. The service paused while my father was taken to a side room, and Liana followed us, her concern unfiltered and real. For 20 minutes we sat together in silence, bound not by rivalry but fear, until the doctor said it was stress, not another attack. Relief washed through me, and something else followed it, a fragile truce born of shared loss. When the service resumed, the atmosphere had changed, the bravado gone, replaced by vulnerability. At the graveside, Julian stood apart from the rest of us, pretending to make calls, while Liana stayed close to our father, holding his arm the way I once had. Back at the house, the reception blurred into casseroles, condolences, and long silences. Business associates gravitated toward Daniel, and I overheard fragments of conversations about failed investments, regulatory fines, and assets being liquidated. Julian drank too much, trying to maintain control that was already gone. As the evening wore on, I noticed Liana watching me, not with envy but confusion, as if the life she believed she had won no longer made sense. Later, after most guests had left, I found her standing alone in our mother's garden, the same place we used to play as children. She spoke first, her voice low and unsteady, saying she didn't know how things had gone so wrong. I didn't answer right away because this moment wasn't about vindication, it was about truth finally catching up. And standing there under fading light, I realized the story between us was far from finished, and the reckoning she feared was only just beginning. We stood in the garden listening to the wind move through the hedges, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because silence felt safer than honesty. Then Liana finally broke, saying she had spent years telling herself she had won something worth keeping, that marrying Julian had been proof she was chosen over me, that every promotion, every house, every trip was supposed to silence the voice that whispered she had built her life on someone else's ruins. She laughed bitterly, admitting it never worked. Julian, she said, had always been restless, always chasing the next deal, the next thrill, the next person who made him feel powerful. She confessed that the first time she suspected his empire was cracking was 2 years earlier when investors quietly pulled out and he told her it was strategy, not failure. I watched her hands shake as she spoke and remembered how steady they used to be when we were children, clinging to each other during storms. She admitted she stayed because leaving would mean admitting she had been wrong, and because the life she displayed online mattered more than the one she lived in private. I told her I had spent years angry replaying that night in the rental apartment, imagining what I would say if I ever faced her again. Yet standing there now, I felt something closer to sadness than rage. I told her Julian didn't choose her because she was better, he chose her because she was available and willing to believe his lies. That betrayal had cost me everything, but it had also forced me to rebuild, honestly. She looked up at me, tears streaking her makeup, and asked if Daniel knew everything. I said he did, and that he had never once used my past to control or belittle me, that love wasn't supposed to feel like competition or survival. Inside the house, a crash echoed, followed by raised voices, and we both turned to see Julian arguing with one of my mother's longtime friends, a retired banker who had once quietly warned my parents about Julian's financial leverage. The argument escalated until Julian stormed out, slamming the door so hard framed photos rattled on the walls. Liana flinched, as if she had expected the house itself to reject him. Later that night, Daniel found me sitting with my father, whose breathing had steadied, though his eyes looked older than they had that morning. He thanked Daniel for staying calm earlier, and said quietly that he had always known something was wrong with Julian, but didn't know how to protect both his daughters without choosing sides. Daniel told him sometimes the truth needs time to surface, and my father nodded as if that eased a weight he had carried too long. When we finally retired for the night, Liana didn't return to the bedroom she shared with Julian. She slept in our mother's old room, curled beneath a quilt we had made together years ago. The next morning, news broke quietly at first, then loudly, that Julian Cross Capital was under federal investigation for misrepresentation and unsafe investment practices. Reporters began calling, and by noon, Julian's name was everywhere. Liana sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone as messages shifted from support to distance to silence. She asked me what I would do, and I told her the same thing I had done when my world collapsed. Tell the truth, even when it costs you, and accept that some losses are necessary. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since childhood she looked at me not as a rival but as a sister, and in that fragile moment I understood that closure doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It arrives quietly when the lies finally stop working. The days that followed unfolded with a heaviness that felt inevitable, as if everything that had been held together by denial was finally allowed to fall apart. Jillian tried to call me twice, and Daniel once, but neither of us answered because there was nothing left to say. Lawyers replaced apologies, and headlines replaced excuses. Liana filed for separation within the week, not out of anger, but exhaustion, admitting she no longer recognized the woman she had become, trying to protect a collapsing illusion. My father's health slowly stabilized, though grief settled into him like a permanent shadow, and I stayed longer than planned, cooking familiar meals, sorting old photographs, and listening to stories I had never heard about my mother's quiet sacrifices and fierce loyalty. One evening, while going through boxes in the attic, I found a letter addressed to both of us, written in my mother's careful handwriting, months before she died. She wrote that she knew her daughters had been divided by something painful and unresolved, and that her greatest wish was not that we forgive quickly, but that we live honestly, even if honesty led us apart before bringing us back together. I gave the letter to Liana, and we cried, not loudly or dramatically, but with the kind of tears that release years of pressure. She admitted she was terrified of starting over without the shield of status, and I told her fear was normal, but staying broken was optional. Daniel and I returned to Seattle shortly after, and life resumed its quieter rhythm. Months later, Liana called to tell me she had sold the house, downsized dramatically, and taken a position with a nonprofit focused on financial transparency, a bitter irony she acknowledged with a soft laugh. She said she didn't expect redemption, but she wanted accountability. My father visited us that winter, walking slower but smiling more, and for the first time in years our family felt real, not curated. One spring morning, as rain tapped gently against our windows, I realized I was pregnant, and when I told Daniel, he held me silently, as if words would only dilute the moment. The thought of bringing new life into a story once shaped by betrayal felt like proof that endings are rarely final, they are simply transitions. Months later, Liana visited, meeting me not with envy but cautious hope, as she placed a small knitted blanket on my lap, saying she wanted to be better, not admired. When my child was born, I thought of my mother and how truth eventually surfaces, no matter how deeply buried. Standing in the hospital room with my sister beside me and my husband holding my hand, I understood that winning had never been about taking something from someone else. It was about choosing integrity when deception seemed easier. And as I looked at the life beginning in my arms, I knew the debt the universe had collected was not paid in revenge, but in clarity, peace, and the courage to live without pretending.